Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
Oh, wow. Good to be back with you two.
Oh, no. Look who's back.
While I was gone, I pretty much avoided any thoughts about work, except for Mondays. I had to tune in. I had to hear you guys. Yes.
How could you miss this show? No, you guys are laughing.
My two
I'm
buddies.
serious.
In other words, how could you miss it? You can't miss it.
No, you cannot. Audience, be quiet there. See, they don't want to stop applauding.
They don't want to stop. What can you do?
She's back. Mom's back.
We're so glad to have you back, Roxanne.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. But speaking of you can't miss it. I started thinking about this while I was gone. So actually, just within the last week, these stories that we've seen come out about Bernie Sanders, and I know we're going to talk about him today, right, Morgan?
Oh, yeah.
I assume so.
Oh, yeah.
And the stories that we're seeing about Bernie Sanders as it relates to Russia, his history with Russia. He celebrated what occasion was it? He
went on his honeymoon in Moscow.
Yes, and then Ronald Reagan warned us about him 40 years ago. All these stories that are coming out now, trickling out now, Morgan told us about it 4 or 5 months ago.
Oh, we hear that all the time. Things pop up and we go, Morgan, didn't you talk about this 3 months ago?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we try to stay ahead of things.
The research you do is unbelievable for one human being.
Well, I don't know about that, but we
I
try. Or I try. I got to make sure not to speak of myself as some kind of strange collective. It's really just me.
Are we going to have fun tomorrow night watching the debate?
Mm-hmm.
Boy, are they going to go after Bernie, though.
Well, you would expect them to. I mean, you see a lot of the Democrat establishment, really lining up against Bernie Sanders, and it looks like Mike Bloomberg is their other option at this point. I don't know. I mean, we hear about Pete Buttigieg, which I just think it's so hilarious because they try to tell you how to pronounce it, and I think, you could probably guess as to why they're trying to tell you to pronounce it that way. But then President Trump, I don't know if you probably don't watch his tweets, Pat, but if you've watched his tweets, he makes a point of always spelling out Buttigieg. And he kind of makes that point, and because that's how they tell you, that's how you're supposed to pronounce it, Buttigieg. Okay, so anyway, Mayor Pete, Mayor Mike, we got the mayors running this time. I'll tell you what. Well, I guess they can run since President Trump never held office previously, so I guess that's kind of destroyed any requirement that you have held higher office at any point, because I think, of course, as you know, if you listen to this show, I think President Trump has done a surprisingly good job as president. And he had no experience. Maybe that's exactly what we needed in the job.
But he did have experience with his television show.
Can you really call The Apprentice experience for being president? I don't know. I'd say he probably hasn't fired enough people. It looked like he had that. He should have fired his entire NSC staff, National Security Council, but he didn't do that. And, there's a lot of partisans involved in government. Particularly during the Obama years, Obama did a pretty good job of stocking up all the low-level and mid-level bureaucrat positions with committed partisans, including the military as well. I don't know if you remember that. I mean, we've talked about that some on this show, how a lot of the generals were kind of moved on out because they didn't support Obama's worldview, President Obama's worldview. And he replaced them with people who did support his worldview. But he also did that throughout the DOJ, and that's why we see people like Peter Strzok and Lisa Page in important positions.
We do see patterns emerge after a president has left office because of what you're describing. That wasn't notable at the time it was happening, but now we're looking back and saying, okay, these were the positions that he filled. This is what he was looking for. Generals who share, or military people who share his worldview.
Well, and they become the base of the resistance, right? The active resistance that's been in place in government that's been resisting President Trump every step along the way has been accusing him of Russian interference. And I'll tell you, that's really fallen apart. I don't know if you've seen any of that, but I'm so glad that President Trump last week appointed U.S. Ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, who's goes by Rick Grenell, to the post of acting director of national intelligence. Now, that's that high-level position that was created over all the intelligence agencies that occurred after 9/11. Because you remember the big story in 9/11 was, we had the information, just nobody was sharing it with each other. If only the FBI had known what the CIA had known, and the CIA had known what the FBI had known, I mean, we could have we could have beaten this problem. We would have known about it in advance. We knew this was going on. They just weren't sharing the information. At least that was the story, right? And so to overcome that problem, let's create a supra agency, an agency above all the other agencies that will force the various agencies to share information. And the head of that's the Director of National Intelligence. So for many years, that was Dan Coates under President Obama. And then it was another gentleman. And, of course, when you appoint these acting DNIs, they can only be in there for a certain period of time. I forget exactly how long it is, but it's less than a year they can actually stay in as acting.
Doesn't it take them a while to get up to speed?
Well, you would think. But, really, what speed do you need to get up to besides thinking critically, asking questions, demanding evidence for various claims that come from the intelligence agencies? And so that's what Ambassador Rick Grinnell has already started to do in his role. And, in fact, and I don't have the exact name pulled up here, but I saw that, because I don't know if you saw it last week, but we started getting the accusation again, Russia's getting involved in the next election. They're going to help President Trump win again. First of all, the first time it was disproved. It's been disproved. I mean, the only actual thing they can point to is the alleged hack of the DNC servers, right? That's the only. Then they've got this Russian troll farm based out of Macedonia that produced all these memes, which Aaron Matei, a very interesting, very liberal reporter, went through and collected all those memes on his Twitter feed. And if you actually take the time to go through and look at the memes, I mean, it's like the least impressive set of memes that I've ever seen. They're terrible.
Nothing subliminal there that's going to sway someone?
You'd have to be, look, if you think Americans are that stupid that those memes are going to change their mind, well, I think you ought to just come out and say it, because that's a pretty huge insult to the voting public. But I guess that's what they're basically saying, is that Americans are that stupid that those few little memes. I mean, I've heard people say this, people I've been in conversation with who are just absolutely convinced that the Russians are involved in our elections, that they love Trump, that Trump is somehow this Russian asset. A friend of mine has been telling me, Trump's been involved with the Russian mob since the 80s. You don't understand. You don't know what I know. I said, well, could you give me some evidence? I just know this because I'm from New York, and we know this in New York. Well, okay, I'm open to the idea. If that's true, just show me the evidence. I would like to see it, because if that's true, then we got to get him out of office. I agree. But where's the evidence? And I try to talk these folks through this stuff, and to me, it's very simple. You can think this through yourself and use your common sense and rely on the evidence that we do know is true, that we do have in place. And that is that there was a FISA warrant, FISA investigation, which means that they could get basically every bit of electronic communication issued for Carter Page. And remember, there's a 2-hop rule on those investigations, so they can get everything that Carter Page had. Then they can get, and we're talking about everything. We're talking about text messages, telephone calls, financial information, every bit of electronic information. The NSA systems are so powerful that they can pull up literally everything about you, every communication you've ever had, audio communication, written communication, your emails, your text messages, your phone calls, everything. They can pull it all up, see who you've talked to. But with the 2-hop rule, they not only get your stuff, but they get the same degree of information about everybody that you've ever communicated with. And now that's just 1 hop right there, okay? Because then they are able to get the same degree of information about everybody that you've communicated with has communicated with. That's the 2-hop rule. And you're talking tens of thousands of people within that 2-hop rule.
Tin cans and strings. Stay safe.
Now, within that yeah,
that's
exactly.
The only way to communicate.
That's right. Smoke signals. Smoke signals are your only way. They can't get to smoke signals. But within that 2-hop rule from Carter Page is who? President Trump, right? Because even if Carter Page didn't directly communicate with President Trump, he directly communicated with somebody who did, probably many people who did, since he was part of the campaign. So within the Carter Page FISA, they get President Trump's electronic communications. And that's exactly why Peter Strzok was able to say before he joined the Mueller investigation, he was able to say to his lover girl, Lisa Page, I don't know that I want to join the investigation because I'm not convinced that at the end of the day there's any big there. And why was he not convinced of that? Because he'd already been through, the FBI already had been through President Trump's electronic communications, and they already knew that he wasn't working with Russia. Period. The end. They knew that before the Mueller investigation even started. And believe me, if he was, they would have leaked that information out, and you would already know it.
And we're back on the Morgan Streetman Show. I want to bring up one other point, Morgan, as we were discussing the Russians, their potential to influence elections. And it's funny when you reference that meme account, because the memes, by my understanding, aren't they usually humorous?
Well, they're supposed to be, right? If they're well done.
That they're trying to get someone's attention through humor. So wouldn't that be the way that you'd attack a foreign country? Let's try to get to them through humor. It's hard to grasp another culture's humor, first and foremost, isn't it?
Yeah, many times it is. I'll tell you what. And sometimes you find things funny that aren't even meant to be funny. Mm-hmm. Like I don't know if you've ever... Have you ever seen this? I mean, President Trump's in India today. I don't know if you got to see the videos, but I mean... capacity crowd at that new cricket stadium they built, and everybody's cheering for him. So
190,000 or 109,000?
Something like that. Yeah, it's a lot.
Had the hats on, the Trump hats on.
Yeah, they're popular. But I tell you, if you ever watch the Indians, when they want to say yes and they want to agree with you, instead of shaking their head like up and down, they shake it side to side.
Interesting.
Which is interesting. So if you ever see an Indian person doing that, they're agreeing with you and they're shaking their head side to side like that. But anyway, so I just find that mildly, humorous. It's just funny cultural differences. I mean, humor is not like we're making fun of them. It's just funny how different people do different things, and yet in our minds, there's one way to do it because culturally that's what we're used to, and that's what we grew up with. And
it is hard to imagine if we're affirming something, doing something other than nodding our head.
Well, right, because that's what you do when you're affirming, right? That's the only thing to do, and so culturally you think of that. I saw we had a caller, Pat.
Yeah, didn't want to go on the air. Oh. Stephanie, she said it's completely off the subject, but she wanted to know if you would investigate or maybe give your opinion on the census. She said that she got the census.
Ooh.
It's 26 pages, I guess.
Oh, my gosh.
And she wanted to know if it's important to fill it out. Do that because there were things that they wanted to know, like how much you make yearly, you, your wife, your husband. Very personal information.
I agree. And let me just, first of all, I have to say there are federal laws relating to this. And my recollection, and I haven't thought about this for how many years, about 10 years now, because that's how often the census happens. But the last time we looked at this, because President Obama was in office then, and they sent out this sort of lengthy questionnaire back then, too. And my recollection is that you are technically legally responsible to state how many people live in your household. And beyond that, you are not legally required to answer all the additional questions. Now, even though you're legally required to state how many people live in your household, my understanding is that they have never really done anything to anybody who hasn't done that. Now, I'd have to brush up on that because I didn't even look into that before today's show. But that's my general recollection. Now, they will come to your house occasionally if you're one of the ones that they decide they've got to get the responses from you, and they'll kind of give you a hard time about it and say, well, you legally have to fill this out and you have to respond. But my recollection from 10 years ago is that at the end of the day, as long as you answer the number of persons in your household, you've complied with your legal duties under the law. And the additional questions are sort of stuff that they're raising that, yes, they would like the answers to, but they cannot legally compel you to answer. Now, I may be wrong about that, so I will look into that for Stephanie, and we'll come back with a more complete answer to that question. But that's just Morgan's shooting from the hip, off the cuff recollection from 10 years ago. Now, we do have some other things we want to talk about today. We do want to get back and talk some about Bernie Sanders. But before we jump into that, I wanted to just get the details, because I pulled them up here, and I wanted to get them out to the folks about this situation with the allegations that the Russians are already trying to interfere in the 2020 elections. And you see what they're doing, right? You see the media and intelligence complex, and they seem to be working together, right? At least in my view. And of course, when you look at this, the CIA actually had a program to put its, at least people that are friendly to the CIA's goals, into the media. And that was called Project Mockingbird. And that started, decades ago. And a lot of people think Anderson Cooper, who I believe interned at the CIA, may be one of their quote-unquote operatives. And certainly you look at Anderson Cooper, he pushes a viewpoint and he pushes an agenda more than a news person should do. He's an opinion giver, and he tries to get his audience to accept and adopt his opinion. But last week, the story came out, and the media just ran with it, that Russia is interfering with the 2020 election. And the reason they're doing this, of course, is to undermine the results of the 2020 election, because they're looking at the Democrat field, and they're seeing who can beat Trump. And they're not seeing anybody. And I'll tell you, it's my opinion at least, the only one with a shot is Bernie Sanders. He's the only one that people get excited about, that people are supporting. And there's a lot of reasons I think you probably shouldn't support Bernie Sanders, right? And we've been over a lot of those on this show. But he's one who does have a lot of support.
And also, he has a support if you were to break down those Democrat voters into all different categories. He's reaching each of those categories, where some of the candidates are really only appealing to one faction.
Right. And you know some interesting stuff about Pete Buttigieg. And you look into his military background. Look, we haven't had the time to do all that research here, but I've certainly seen the stories and seen the suggestions, and I've looked at the pictures of him allegedly in Afghanistan with no unit patch on, with no name patch on his uniform. That's not standard. That's not normal. Was he actually over there in a military capacity? Or, was he over there for a photo op? Photo op is what some of these stories are suggesting. It's also been alleged that he never went to basic training. And you really can't be in the military without starting off in basic training or boot camp, right? So I don't know. There's something there to be looked into. I don't know exactly what the end result is, but there's something there. But let me swing back now to this story of Russian interference, because what happened last week was it was reported that the Russians were already interfering in the 2020 election on the side of President Trump. And that apparently was being determined by an intelligence official named Shelby Pearson. And she was supposedly the top election security official in the intelligence community. Well, what does the newly appointed acting DNI, Rick Grinnell, do? And he says, okay, I'm in charge of all this. Bring me the evidence. Bring me the evidence. And, of course, instead of bringing the evidence, you know what happens next? Well, the U.S. intelligence community starts to say, well, it looks like Shelby Pearson may have overstated the intelligence community's formal assessment of Russian interference, that she may have overstepped her authority and overstepped the bounds of what she's supposed to be doing. And perhaps we don't have any evidence of this allegation that we wanted to make. Well, and that's the truth, isn't it? Just like before, they made the allegation, turned out they didn't have any evidence. Well, here, once again, they're making the allegation again, same allegation, the one they wanted you to buy before. But, when I was talking to my friend, who's pretty liberal, and I talk to a lot of people that are liberal, but this guy in particular is always hammering me with this Russian interference stuff. Last week, talking to him, and he says, you see, they're already doing it again, man. Russians are already interfering, man. Trump's their guy, man. He's Putin's buddy. He's an agent of Putin. They're already back in it. So people are buying these headlines that are being pushed out by a complicit media complex that has an end goal in mind, which is undermining President Trump. And then we're finding out when we got somebody in there who is doing their job, like Ambassador Rick Grinnell, and saying, okay, bring me the evidence. I want to see this. They say, oh, you evidence? Maybe she overstepped her bounds.
March 2021, right around March, April, impeachment round number 2.
Well, I mean, isn't that what we're setting up for that? We're setting up for that. So anyway, just something we wanted to point out to you, and you won't find this information front and center. You won't find this on the front page. You know, it's so disappointing to me as somebody who tries to keep up with a lot of the media when I see the media get it so wrong so many times, and then they just switch tunes and pretend like it never even happened. They don't ever come back to you and emphasize that they got it wrong. They don't ever come back and say, you know what, we reported this, but now this turns out, the opposite turns out to be the case. And you know what, we were wrong, but take note. What we said before is not correct, and now this new thing is correct. You know, it's kind of like, I don't know if you saw this, but some Chinese researchers have come out and said in a Communist Party publication in China that they can confirm now that the COVID-19, the coronavirus, the novel coronavirus that we've got, that we're dealing with the outbreak right now, did not originate in that Huanan seafood market. So now the Communist Chinese are confirming that it didn't originate after they held on to that story for a month and a half and acted like it was true.
Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. Now, Morgan, I have to admit that while I was gone, I kind of wanted to have happy thoughts in my brain. So everything that's been going on with the coronavirus, you know, I wanted to keep up with it, but then it's scary.
Well, it's so funny because looking at the notes, I have a stack of notes, and I don't keep all the notes, but I try not to leave them lying around. I don't want anybody going, what in the world? What's this guy
These
thinking
are the ramblings
about?
of a madman.
Last week?
Huh?
Didn't you leave him here last week?
No, I left some of my articles, which had some notes and highlights on them.
Shriner loves that.
I know he does. I didn't bring him any this week, though. I was busy all weekend, so I have nothing printed out. I just have some scribbled notes. But I have my notes from past weeks, and I'm looking here, and I'm seeing coronavirus, 17,000 sick, 360 killed. And let me see, I had another one in here. Anyway, they're low numbers is my point compared to what we can share with you today. And, of course, these are just the reported cases. Yeah, I've got, this must have been way early on. This is when they just had quarantined 41 million people in 13 cities. I've got 2,000 cases and 80 deaths. Now, you're talking about in China at the time. So the numbers we can share with you today, and I'm sure these are not even completely up to date because they're the latest ones I could find before we went on the air. And by the way, there was a press conference, which we'll tell you about, in China this morning, about 6 o'clock this morning. But now the latest figures for China and the coronavirus are 77,150 cases with 2,592 reported deaths. Now, remember, we've got some folks who might have some knowledge, like a Chinese billionaire who's in exile who says the numbers are closer to 1.5 million cases with 50,000 plus deaths. And by the way, that was a couple of weeks ago. But these are the reported numbers for China, 77,150 cases and over almost 2,600 deaths. South Korea, and I had to update these this morning because there were like 100 and something new cases disclosed overnight. But now they got 833 cases in South Korea, most of which center around this one particular church where a lady was sick and wound up getting a lot of people sick at the church. And they report 7 deaths in South Korea officially from coronavirus. Now, that's the numbers there are up. The number of reported cases are up 25% in 1 week. That's a lot of new cases. So we're trying to keep that under control outside of China. Obviously, they're having trouble within China controlling this, and the numbers are way off the charts compared to the SARS outbreak that occurred back in 2003 And, of course, way off the charge from the MERS outbreak, and these are very similar coronaviruses that occurred in 2012 or 2013. Now, what's interesting is Italy is now reporting 152 cases, and they say that the rest of Europe is getting ready to attempt to almost quarantine the state of Italy. 152 cases with 3 deaths. And, your big fear, or one of the big fears, I think, is coronavirus getting into countries that really have no effective means to do anything about it. Now, China's
if this was really in a biolab where it started, somebody's responsible, so they'd be keeping these numbers down.
Well, sure, and they've never identified patient zero. I mean, you're bringing up an interesting point, because while they have now admitted that this didn't start in the wet market, the seafood market, where, look, they kill frogs and things like that, and it must have come from there. No, it didn't. That was the story they held to for a long time. I mean, obviously you can't trust the Chinese media. You cannot trust the official story coming out of China, and we've talked to you about that before. But they've never identified patient zero. Normally, in an outbreak of an epidemic, that's one of the first things you want to do. Who was the first case of this? Where did this start and come from? Because that's going to lead you potentially to ways to deal with it, right? And they've never identified patient zero. Now, they may know who it is, but they've not told us publicly who was the first person allegedly to get this. Did this come out of the lab there at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which seems to be the most likely candidate for this? We don't know. But one of the big fears you'd have is this getting into countries that don't have the ability to try to control this in any way. They don't have functioning national health systems that are sufficient to attempt to control this. I'm thinking of a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. If this gets out there, they're going to be in big trouble. They just don't have the facilities. They don't have the money. They don't have the infrastructure to try and control this.
Or effectively treat people.
Just like with the Ebola outbreaks there. And people get very suspicious, particularly in a place like that where, witchcraft is still widely practiced, where they think, the government is actually giving it to you if you go into the hospitals. If you report as sick, they're actually giving it to you. So don't go to the hospitals. Don't report yourself as being sick. But a place that might have echoes of that type of thing, in other words, a country that's not as developed, be Iran. And, they've got 61 confirmed cases now in Iran. And as of late last week, they're reporting 8 deaths officially. That's now jumped to 12 deaths officially. And actually, Iranian lawmakers have come out and said that there are actually closer to 50 deaths. Now, if there are 50 deaths, it's pretty hard to believe that there are only 61 cases. And it's suspected, because they've got a number of people under quarantine in Iran, that there may be as many as 900 cases currently in Iran.
And if you stick to those first numbers in Iran, and you're talking, okay, there are only 61 cases, but that many deaths, that's about a 20% rate of death.
Which is much higher than what's being reported in China officially, and much higher than what's being reported in South Korea. Other things that are interesting about this particular virus is it's being reported that you can have it, supposedly get well, get over it, and then become reinfected. Now, normally your body would produce antibodies, and you would not be able to catch the same virus twice. So there would have to be a mutation. But in this case, apparently, and we don't know if a mutation is involved because there just hasn't been enough scientific study of it, but apparently in this case, you can become reinfected relatively easily. Now, this is really going to affect the Chinese economy. In fact, Chairman Xi, Emperor for Life, came out yesterday in China and said that this is a severe and complex epidemic and that it's going to have a big impact on the economic activity of China. And where we can see that is primarily in small businesses in China, what they call SMEs, or small and medium enterprises. And you're talking about everything from street vendors to small manufacturers. Now, this is where 80% of the Chinese population is employed. And what's the biggest problem that they're facing right now is the workers are not coming back to work. People are scared to death. They do not trust their government because the Chinese people have figured this out. They're smart enough to know that the government is going to lie to them repeatedly, and they don't trust the information coming out of their government. Now, we're the only ones people are like, well, no, you got to trust what the Chinese government says. I mean, are you kidding me? Don't be stupid. Chinese people don't trust what the Chinese government says. So they're actually staying home because the Chinese government is now saying it's safe to return to work. Let's get everybody back to work because they're realizing we cannot continue this situation, this quarantine where nobody's going to work, this extended Lunar New Year that's now gone several weeks past when it was supposed to be over. We can't keep this going. We absolutely can't keep this going. And interestingly, 1/3 of Chinese SMEs, small and medium enterprises, or small businesses, 1/3 of them have less than 1 month of cash remaining. So if they don't get back into production, if they don't get back into commerce, if they don't get back into selling, if the street vendors don't get back into selling the items that they sell to people on the street, they're going to run out of money and they're going to go bankrupt effectively. Although they don't really have a bankruptcy system in China like we do here in the U.S., but they're going to be out of money and they're going to stop functioning, cease to exist. And within 2 to 3 months, 85%, so it's a third, have about a month's worth of cash. Now, if you look at, okay, once you get to 2 to 3 months out, how many percentage of businesses are out of cash? It goes up to 85%. So, I mean, you're talking about there's only 15% of Chinese small businesses left if this goes on for another 2 to 3 months and economic activity does not restart. And so that's why they're rushing to restart. They're trying to say, okay, we got it under control. What we did worked. Now everybody get back to work. Let's pretend like it never happened. But the truth is they really don't have this under control. That's the truth. But they're realizing now we cannot keep going down the path that we're going, this quarantine path, this house arrest path where everybody's on lockdown. We can't keep this up. And so that, they've even started to offer incentives. Now, incentives come first, right? The carrot always comes before the stick. But they're trying to offer carrots. And just to give you an example, Foxconn, which is not a small and medium-sized enterprise, it's a big business, Foxconn, but it's one of the main suppliers for Apple. Foxconn is offering its workers 7,000 won to return to work and work for 55 days. Now, that doesn't mean 55 days straight, but to return to work and including days off like weekends, to work the next 55 working days, they'll give you 7,000 won. That's equivalent to about $1,000 US. So that's no small bonus just to show up for work. And what's being reported, again, I don't trust these numbers, but what's being reported by Chinese businesses allegedly is that something around or less than 50% of workers are reporting to work. So they're half staff right now. And the rest do not want to report. They do not want to come in. And so that's why it may be why we're supposing that may be why they had this World Health Organization press conference this morning at 6 a.m. our time, Eastern time. That ran late. There was probably polishing up with the censors exactly what they were allowed to say. And exactly how do you want us, Chairman Xi, to present the information? What should we say here? And they came out with a lot of information that I think is pretty bland. And they came out and said things like, wow, the average age of people infected is 51. Primarily infects people aged 30 to 59 years old. 70% of the cases are from Hubei province. But the virus is age indifferent, they said. Now, what was important, because obviously they're not letting any of the truth out, what was important about this is they said, the Chinese approach to lockdown has been effective, but they're warning because other societies don't exist in authoritarian mode like China where you could just lock all these people down. This won't work in other societies. Now, let's flip back and see if they're telling the truth because Jennifer Zing of Epoch Times has reported there are 50 to 60,000 people in hospitals in Wuhan. There were 18 crematoriums working 24/7, 3 of which have totally burned out from overuse. Got a little more when we come back.
Welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. Morgan talking off air, trying to get a handle on some of the factors that affect the coronavirus, wondering even if weather might come into play. China is on the same they have the same sort of weather patterns that we do. In other words, their winter is the same time as ours.
Right. They're northern hemisphere.
Yes. So would we see the virus possibly lose strength as the weather gets warmer, or is it not really affected by those things?
We don't have any reason to believe that we would see that right now. Now, I think one of the things that can happen in the colder weather is people's immune systems can be slightly depressed by the colder weather. And that's why we see the flu season many times in the colder months. But there's no reason right now, given what we know so far, to believe that there's any seasonality to this coronavirus. So what we could see is just an increasing number of cases from here on out throughout the year. And this is something I think, if you look at what the experts have said, this is something that's going to be with us for a long time. I mean, we may not ever get rid of this. And this is something that didn't exist on our planet that we knew of, okay? And it wasn't in some obscure bat that somebody ate in some soup. We now know that was a lie. This didn't exist before the end of the year last year. That's the first time we've ever heard of this, which that makes it even more likely that it was potentially created inside of some kind of a bioweapons lab. Now, if this is something that you can catch after you've already been infected with it, I mean, that even more makes it sound like a very useful bioweapon, something that you can never get rid of. So I wanted to share one other fact with you. There was a Hunan doctor, not Huanan, but a Hunan doctor in China who said that he treated 50 new cases, it's just one doctor, on the same day that the Chinese numbers reported one new case. And this was, I think, last week. But the point is, China wants you to believe that this rate of infection, that this epidemic is now slowing down, that the measures that they've taken have gotten on top of it, and things are getting better. And you know what? It's getting to be over with. It's time for everybody to come back to work, etc. That's what they want you to believe. But that doesn't seem to be true. So we're going to have to wait and see what all comes of this. Just like many things that we're dealing with right now, we're going to have to wait and see until we get some more information.
Found a little tidbit. The hope is that it slows down into the spring and summer because, again, as you alluded to, people's immune system's down, but also you have less people congregating indoors where it's easily spread from person to person.
Well, and we wait to see how long, as you pointed out during the break, how long does this last on, surfaces? I mean, how long does it last on? What happens if you get some product shipped from China and somebody in the factory was sick? Are there little virus particles stuck to the side of the product and you go open up your product and now you've got the virus? We're going to have to wait and see. We don't know the answer to those questions. This hasn't been studied long enough and in great enough detail because this never existed before. We never had this before. So this has just come out. And we're totally beholden to the Chinese media. Now, I wanted to, speaking of another virus infecting, it seems like Bernie Sanders is infecting the Democrat Party. And they, at least the DNC club that typically decides the elections, just like they did last time, where they said, you know what, we can't have Bernie Sanders. Let's make sure it goes to Hillary. And they did that. And that's been established. And Bernie kind of, took a knee and wound up a millionaire. Okay? Now, we're not saying one happened because of the other, but, he took a knee and all of a sudden the committed diehard socialist has got 3 homes and millions of dollars, as Michael Bloomberg pointed out, although Bloomberg's not really one to be throwing any stones about anybody because of wealth. But they've now come out and announced that Bernie had kind of run away with the Nevada caucus. And by the way, since when did it start taking the Democrats so long to count the votes of their caucuses? I mean, what's going on with the Democrat Party? They can't even come up with the results of their own votes until like a week after the fact. But anyway, they've come out. Bernie got 46%. Biden, they say, got 19.6%. He didn't even know when he was in Las Vegas. He thought he was in California. I mean, Biden is just so out to lunch. But he apparently got 19.6%. Buttigieg got 15.3%. Warren 10.1%, and Klobuchar 4.8%. At least that's the numbers I was looking at.
I don't want to jump right back into the virus, but I just got a text from someone that's listening to the show and said, has Morgan heard that it's a mix of SARS, HIV, and TB?
I have heard that. Yeah. I'm scared to run with some of this stuff because I'm not running my own lab. I'm not looking into this stuff scientifically. But yeah, I have heard that. I've heard that it contains components of various different other viruses. And, if we look back at some of our previous research on Lyme disease and the potential creation for Lyme disease being a mishmash of other tick-borne viruses. And that's actually what it appears to be. So, again, we haven't done any definitive scientific research on any of this, and we certainly haven't had the chance. But, yeah, I've seen those stories, and it makes one wonder, are they trying to combine the best traits of these different viruses for the purpose of creating a super weapon? Now, I had pulled up, I must have shut it down. I had pulled up the audio from Bernie Sanders last night saying, you know what? There were some good things about Fidel Castro. I mean, come on 60 Minutes. I know you probably didn't hear that. By the face you gave me, Pat, you didn't hear that.
I didn't. I missed it last night.
So I got to think one place that Bernie will not be winning the primary is going to be the state of Florida. I mean, because that's going to be on every ad down in South Florida, and certainly the Cubans who live in Florida and the Venezuelans who live in Florida, of which there are many, are not going to stand for that kind of talk. Where Bernie Sanders, kind of like what he said. Excuse me, I hope I don't have the coronavirus. I got having trouble keeping my voice this morning a little bit. But kind of like what he said, with respect when he was over in Moscow. Hey, there's some good things about this system. They got pretty little subway stations, artwork everywhere. This is a highly cultured society, this Soviet system. When he had his honey, remember, and they all got together and sang, "This land is your land. This land is my land." Remember all that fun with our shirts off? We played that for you before. You can go out there and find that video on the internet if you want to watch it.
Got to be Bernie and Michelle.
It's worth watching. It's worth watching. Well, here comes the music. We haven't even got to our Out There yet. Just want to throw a few things at you with this Out There. We don't know what's going on with this, but there was a former Department of Homeland Security official named Philip Haney who was found dead near San Francisco, California, over the weekend from a single gunshot wound from a firearm that was found lying next to his body. And they've already ruled that this is a suicide. But I'll tell you, a lot of people are suspicious of this. A lot of people. He was a whistleblower. He blew the whistle on the Obama administration, moving high-level Islamists into key positions and trying to bring people from Muslim countries here to the United States without proper checks. He was with the Department of Homeland Security since 2002, and there are a lot of suspicious people. I've been getting messages from him this morning. We're going to look into this some more. I'm Morgan Streetman. That's the way I see it. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.